I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about the value of philosophical fiction. Is fiction that uses philosophical ideas any more valuable than other types of fiction? Are there, in fact, any other types of fiction other than philosophical fiction? Here is a list of books that readers might consider philosophical. 1984, An Animal Farm by George Orwell, Nausea and No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, The Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille, The Stranger by Albert Camus, Candide by Voltaire, and The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. What is common among all these books that makes them philosophical fiction? Is it that they are written by writers who are also known to be philosophers? This might be true in the case of Sartre, Bataille, and Camus, but Dostoevsky and Orwell are not primarily known as philosophers. All these works that I've listed have an explicit storyline versus something like a philosophical treatise like, for example, The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, of which no storyline can be found. Instead, what we have is an extended and persistent argument. These works point at some aspects of the human condition, but does it make them philosophic? And some of these works are performative, where they don't explicitly lay out their philosophical view, but they act it out through the experience of the characters. So we have talked about literature as a medium for storytelling and for philosophical fiction, but there are also films that are overtly about philosophy. For example, Zizek's works, Pervert's Guide to Ideology and his Pervert's Guide to Cinema. And then there are other movies as well, such as The Examined Life, which interviews a slew of philosophers. But those are not the works that I'm concerned with. What I'm concerned with are the kinds of films or books that aren't explicitly laying out a philosophy or speaking about philosophy, but contains philosophical ideas, such as The Matrix, which talks about how artificial intelligence may in the future bring us an apocalyptic world, how gene modification technologies might lead finally to create a superclass of perfect human beings, leaving no space for the unmodified. So that's the big idea in Gattaca. Or how in the platform, where depending on how we are arbitrarily placed in a society, it might determine our fates and how we act to the ones below us and how we should act to the ones below us. I've also put a few films in there that you might not have heard of, but I highly recommend watching if you are interested in philosophical films, like My Dinner with Andre and Synecdoche, New York. There's also theatre, which can express philosophical ideas. For example, Les Miserables, written originally by Victor Hugo, which you could see elements of the question of what is justice and how should a man live his life? What is the good life? Can you think of any good movies, TV series, or plays that you consider philosophic? In fact, for any movie to qualify as a good movie, must it be philosophic? Why are stories amenable to philosophizing? To answer this question, we have to ask ourselves, what is philosophy? And then ask ourselves, what is storytelling? Which are both very difficult questions, of course, but I'm going to talk instead about what they are about. So philosophy has many fields, and some of them which you can find in stories are the fields of axiology or values or ethics, philosophical anthropology, which deals with the condition of man, political philosophy, which muses about what makes a good society, epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, asking questions like how do we know what we know, and metaphysics, which is about the nature of reality. Even as I have listed these fields, I think you could match some movies that will fall into all these categories. What are stories then about? They are about our life experiences, about how we suffer, how we love, hate, pleasure and pain that we experience, and also the dilemma we face between how to lead our lives and then the fear of death or the acceptance of death. They could be fantasy, a make-believe world. It could talk about the incredible or impossible, like with superhero stories. And it could be about spirits, which would belong to the genre of horror films or the supernatural. They deal with human psychology and behavior, how we act, crimes, themes of sacrifice, and the hero-villain dichotomy that we often find in stories that makes us identify with them so strongly. They explore the unknown, the impossible or the incredible. This would be your science fiction or books and movies about the supernatural. They could be allegories where they have an underlying meaning. So in that way they could be moralizing. For example, the fairy tale about the boy calling wolf. They could be polemical. For example, an Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, where it is ramming home an ethical point. So, which came first, philosophy or these stories? Or is it that these two sources mutually inspire each other? For example, how Camus might have taken his literary ideas from his philosophy of absurdism? Or was it the other way around, where his story of how absurd the world is led him to philosophize about absurdism? Or is it that they mutually influence each other? We can certainly find the whole slew, where sometimes philosophy comes first, sometimes the stories come first, and sometimes they mutually interact with each other, informing each other. But before we run away with the idea that fiction is itself philosophy, we must realize that when we say philosophical fiction, we are using the word philosophical as an adjective. So it is meant to describe the type of fiction, while philosophy itself is a noun. A work of philosophy is philosophical because it is a work of philosophy. But that does not mean that what is philosophical makes it philosophy. What is philosophy? Is philosophy something that is systematic, where it has to lay out an entire system of how we should understand things, of the nature of reality, of how we should live our lives? Must they all come in the forms of treatises, of massive books that argue the arguments from every single angle? Works of fiction obviously differ from that. They use some philosophical ideas here and there, or maybe as a departure point to tell a story, but they are definitely not a systematic argument. For example, Minority Report might be considered as a metaphor against the evils of profiling and discrimination. The Ship of Theseus, an Indian film made in 2012, uses the philosophical idea of the Ship of Theseus of identity as a departure point to meditate about gratitude, principles, and about taking actions to make it a better world. Often, works of fiction uses the plot device of Deus Ex Machina to save the day. For example, The Lord of the Rings might be considered as a philosophical tale about good versus evil. But the ring in Lord of the Rings, what is exactly the analog here to the real world? To draw conclusions from fiction can be dangerous. For example, in a dystopian world of the Matrix, why do we expect robot wars and not a state of robot utopia? Battlestar Galactica, the TV series made in the 2000s, have the robots, the Cylons, be monotheistic creatures, while the people in that time, in that future, are polytheistic. What is it trying to say about the state of whether a belief in God should be monotheistic or polytheistic? And futuristic sci-fi must presume a familiar attitude of things, because otherwise we simply cannot understand it. But why do we assume that attitudes and ideas don't change in the future? For example, in Ender's Game and in Evangelion, it presupposes that children are vulnerable, which is why when we watch where the children have to fight the enemy, we feel a certain unfairness for them. But who knows how kids will be in the future? Philosophical fiction often hints at things through a certain kind of intuition, perhaps. But we still need exposition, arguments, dialectics, and discourse before these can become philosophy. Fiction suspends certain truths and facts and probabilities just to make the plot work. For example, we see many films that have time travel elements, and the possibility of time travel is taken for granted. But that is completely hypothetical. Fiction can be taken to give certain possibilities of a potential future, or it could simply be wishful thinking. For example, how a technologically advanced Wakanda, waiting to be discovered in the Black Panther, would save Africa and save the world. And they often present silver bullets that would save us from the current problems that are plaguing us. For example, interstellar travel to escape from polluted, unlivable Earth in the movie Interstellar. If we draw conclusions from this, we might get the wrong conclusion to think that we don't have to do anything about our environment and climate change because some technological silver bullet is going to be saving us. Plato criticizes poetry, and by poetry he really means all of literature, with the idea of mimesis, which is imitation. He has a theory of forms where there's an ultimate reality out there of ideal objects, such as an ideal chair, but an artist who paints or describes or writes about a chair is really creating a depiction or picture of a chair. And this is twice removed from reality. So it is a form of deception, which is then not virtuous, while we should focus on knowing reality, and that is true philosophy. Aristotle responds to his critique of the arts and gives us a way out by saying that the artist is in fact not trying to teach what is real. The aim of art is to provide aesthetic pleasure or communicate a message and so on. So art should be judged on these goals. For example, how well an artist as a craftsman has executed his craft. Plato himself is not innocent of using fiction as a narrative device, where he comes up with the allegory of the cave, of how a man is sitting tied up in a cave and can only see shadows on the wall, to even illustrate his theory of the forms. So clearly fiction has a role to bring ideas to us. Which brings us to what is the value of philosophical fiction. While logic and facts might be objective, they may leave us untouched, while art can evoke an emotional response in us, which would then provoke pleasure or give us an impetus to do something. Fiction also has the benefit of expressing difficult concepts in simple terms and illustrating it through vivid reenactment, making them accessible to the masses. For example, we may see that there's a tyranny of the majority in Squid Game, making it very vivid for us why majority rule may be problematic or majority decision making might be problematic. Naturally, they provide a source of entertainment, which is why we turn to them in the first place. Some good writers give a very good phenomenological exploration, for example, to the reactions to the monster in Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, or how Sartre's protagonist reacts with nausea upon realizing the underlying reality of the world. Science fiction can be seen as a laboratory to try out theories and ideas. For example, The Idea of Utopia, written by Thomas More. Good philosophical fiction provokes reflection in us on the state of affairs that the book is about, and they may also inspire contemplation. So it stirs us to think more deeply and to think about important themes such as justice, such as meaning. In keeping with the tradition of philosophical fiction, I had also written a work with many philosophical themes such as politics, freedom of speech, whether we have free will, and the philosophy of technology on the implications of artificial intelligence and consciousness in the future of work, as well as whether technology is neutral. So I hope you swing by and have a listen to my story, which is a full book-length work. You can find my book Experience the Revolution on YouTube and on my blog where the text is available and will be released chapter by chapter.